Hello and welcome to week 5 and chapter 5 here in Developmental Psych as we make our way through the end of our discussion on childhood prior to going into adolescence and beyond. Now, I started the course book with some interesting graphics about what a typical child's room may look like. And you'll see here that despite the bins, despite the shelves, despite you can see some organizational quality here, probably put together by mom, this little girl simply does not have the skill set yet to organize her room. In order to organize a room, you have to see things from multiple dimensions. Remember when we were talking about pre-operational thinking, we were talking about centration. When the reason why, and it all kinds of comes together, the reason why young children in pre-operational thinking are not able to reverse actions, or they're fooled by the actual dimensions of an object and make typical mistakes related to those in terms of conservation and whatnot, because of centration. Now, when we as adults with concrete and in some cases formal operational thinking, we organize things along a lot of dimensions. So we might have a shelf, and the shelf contains books, dimension 1. The shelf contains books, and they go from large to small, dimension number 2. Separate from the next shelf, which is some sort of toy, let's say Legos, and we put the big pieces together, the little pieces together, and the tiny pieces together. Each time we categorize something like that, we're moving beyond the capacities of young children. So, my advice to parents is really to lower your expectations until your child is 9, and then they too can have a room just like this. Like that will ever happen. Now, that's the dream room, right? I pulled that right off a website of how daycare providers can organize the toys in their rooms. That will last approximately 5 seconds, and then the toys will be everywhere, as we well know, which is great. That's what toys are for. Okay, the first topic that I get into here is actually talking about sports. And we're going to be talking about the way in which children interact with a larger social circle in a number of contexts during this middle and late childhood stage. During this period of time, there is an incredible amount of brain development going on, myelination, dendrification, and synaptic pruning as the child is growing, and growing physically as well as cognitively through interactions, and sports is a great way to do that. Now, we're talking about young sports, okay? Kid sports where everybody plays. This is important to distinguish that from adolescent and into adulthood play, and maybe a little bit in transition in late adulthood. When we in late childhood, when we introduce the concept of competition, and that you don't always make the team, and there is a winner. Very early on, sports and games are very important because of this development here. It's also associated with other great aspects of development, which include satisfaction in life, satisfaction with the family. That increases in physical development, strength, endurance, those kinds of things, and very closely connected to better academics. There's a whole series of research, whole series of books connecting physical education to increasing academic performance. Personally, I've always been a fan of physical education, and I believe it should be required K through 12. Yep, even when you're too cool to be in gym shorts, you should be changing into gym shorts and getting out there on the field, because it's going to help your academics. And so that is a good thing. Okay, now we are facing a problem, however, because our schools are not requiring physical education. We have a lot more electronic devices that enable us to engage ourselves, children engaging themselves, and adults engaging themselves without physical activity And so we are faced, yes, with an obesity problem. And this starts right now in childhood. Every child, just about, unless there's some sort of thing going on, starts off as a healthy child. We introduce, because of our busy lives, because of our personal sort of laziness, and our maybe our own interest in these things, we introduce video games, high fat foods, and an emphasis on studying academics versus activity. And that leads to a mildly obese child. Soon, taking the stairs becomes hard. They're moving more weight than their little bodies can actually maintain, and they take the elevator, they start taking, give me a ride across the street, those kind of things. They move into a moderately obese state as a child. Exercise is now uncomfortable. When they go to gym class, this is not fun. Their heart is racing, they're in pain, and that leads to further neglect, and we have this vicious cycle, as the graphic says, of creating adults who are obese. It is vitally important that we engage children in physical activity. Don't sit them in front of the TV all the time. It's perfectly okay some of the time. Nothing wrong with video games, nothing wrong with iPad. Those should be rewards. They should be rewards for doing the outside stuff if they're not into that. Okay. Our next topic here in this stage, of course, is I introduced it a little bit when we talk about Piaget. We talk about the next stage. We talk about Piaget all semester so far. In Piaget's cognitive development stages, we're now looking at concrete operational thinking. Now, this means that these children are able now to take the schemas that they have, their understandings of the world, the increasingly complex schemas that they have as a result of assimilation and accommodation. They can now manipulate those. They can add them together. What if this is with that? They can take things away. They can move things around. They can do what if scenarios, but it's all based on schemas that are largely within the realm of their real experience. Now, I will say that with special effects and with video games the way they are, that some of the things that used to be beyond concrete operational thinking are now within the grasp of operational thinking, such as, flying across the room or something like with wings, because they've actually experienced them within the concrete experience of a video or of a movie or a video game or something like that. That these are still concrete in terms of they've experienced them and they've seen them, not able to quite imagine them without those experiences, but nonetheless, they seem to be pushing the envelope in terms of development here. And some kids end up pretty early with some formal operational thinking strategies and skills that we'll get into in adolescence. Now, further delineating what's happening here, cognitively speaking, this is when everything really, really starts to get charged up. Now, we have the ability for inductive reasoning. Now, what this means, this is the introduction of logic. And, we talked about the terrible twos, the tornado threes or whatever. Now we're into the 4, 5s, and 6, where they're using logic now. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's kind of a larger. They're using logic. They can actually, this is really one of those times when children start pointing out when you're wrong. When you are wrong. Like, Mom, that makes no sense. This. And they can do that a lot. That's inductive reasoning. We're going to get into deductive reasoning, Sherlock Holmes and all that, when we talk about formal operational thinking, because we need formal operational thinking for that. But inductive reasoning, it's just this, that. If this, then that. It's the logic of computers. And see, this is kind of when there's that, for some kids, they really get into those computer programming and programming languages and whatnot, doing those kinds of activities, because this makes perfect sense. If, then statements, the kind of logic base statements that we see in binary coding and whatnot. So, really interesting way in which our computers match concrete operational thinking. In fact, this just occurred to me. That's probably the difference between artificial intelligence and regular intelligence. Artificial intelligence is great, but it's very concrete, whereas true human intelligence is formal operational. We'll think about that later. These children are able to classify things along multiple dimensions. So they're able to understand birds and then types of birds and then birds that fly, birds that don't, all those kind of ways in which, so there's this great world of multiplicity starts to happen within these children. Not to mention, this occurs also with themselves. They're able to have much more rich self-concept because they're able to see themselves in multiple perspectives. They can see themselves as a classmate and the kinds of relationships they have with their age mates there and with the teacher, and they see that as distinct from their relationship with their peers at home, their brothers and sisters, and their parents. They can now conceive of this. The world thrust it upon them because we've just thrown them into school, but at the same time their cognition is ready for that to happen. In addition, we see decentration, reversibility, seriation, you're putting things in order, and finally, a little sad, the death of childhood. And what I refer to, this phrase came to me years and years ago, the death of childhood. What starts to disappear at this point is the magical quality, not the interesting scientific quality of the world, but the magical quality. Children at this age in our country, for example, discover that there is no Santa Claus, at least not the way we imagine, that the Easter Bunny doesn't lay eggs, those kinds of things. You can't be throwing the, hay on the ground and say Santa's reindeer came by. They're beyond that now. And so there's a little bit of a sadness from an adult perspective of this loss of magical quality of the world that we see in the pre-operational. However, there's this emerging awesome curiosity of the world and this cognitive ability to manage it, which is really, these are the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th graders who you talk to those teachers and they are sponges. Most of the time, sponges for information. They're just very, very eager learners because now they have these new cognitive capacities to seriate things, organize them among multiple classifications. Very, very cool stuff. They're engaging in conversations. They can talk about social complexities within conversations and stuff. They become very, very aware of their environments and how people are interacting, and they can see those sort of dynamics happening. Very, very cool age, but there is that sort of imaginative piece that has changed. So moving from here, we'll take a switch just like we have been and looking at information processing, and for this particular set, we'll get the assistant of yet another Star Wars character, BB-8. Now, in the information processing world, we have increases in short-term memory, more able to pay attention because they can screen out information. And I say information like other stuff coming into their sensory system, they're able to screen that out a little bit better. Memory strategies can now be taught, like, the different ways in which we memorize things, different studying, flashcards, mnemonics, those kinds of activities, and the introduction to metacognition. Because they can now think about things the way they do, they can actually engage in thinking about thinking, which is metacognition. So at this point, schools start to expect kids to say, okay, here's this problem in front of you. What strategy are you going to use? Just yesterday, I was reviewing the math workbook of my niece, who is 7. And it was interesting, very, very well constructed workbook on mathematics about, carrying over from subtraction. It wasn't new math, which I was kind of excited about. But all of these things, but there was times in the book where it would take time off and say, what other kinds of problems can you solve using this strategy? And you can see that expectation from the school saying, okay, we know you can do this now, so start thinking about how you have this new skill and how you can apply it in different ways. Now the last one here in information processing, we see the basics of critical thinking. It's kind of like theory of mind in terms of such a door-opening component of cognitive development. So critical thinking is the ability to evaluate different pieces of data and select which is the best to go with. So this requires an internal process of trying out each solution internally, picking the one that works out best in the internal model and applying that to your problem solving situation. We can see that in the academic world, but we can also see that in terms of the decision making that kids are making. We're going to get into that same moral decision making where a child is now able to go, okay, I can do this or I can do that, and what will be the most likely results based on how I understand the world right now. And they can then make a decision based on their understanding of the world. Very different than the automated sort of behavioral stimulus response type learning that we see in very early childhood. They're able to think things through. They're able to make decisions. And we as parents sit with our children and we go through, rather than saying something is right or wrong, we actually go through the process of the thinking, or we model the process of the thinking. We might say, well, how do you think Billy will feel when you steal his truck? Or how do you think Billy feels right now that he can't find his truck because you have it? And then that sort of perspective taking, but also critical thinking skills starting to kick in that are going to be so much more enhanced as we make our way through the various stages here. So we leave BB-8 behind and we enter into the fascinating world of intelligence. I used this period of time in the class to introduce the theories of intelligence really quickly, because IQ and its comparative qualities and multiple intelligence, which it's with its industry implications, are important in terms of this going to school time. So in intelligence, we have the idea of IQ, which I'll spend some time on, and then we have, in the modern theories of intelligence, we have multiple intelligence introduced by Robert Sternberg and Howard Gardner. So let's take these on one at a time and understand where they are. They all coexist and what they mean in terms of this stage of development. So we look first at IQ. And to explain what this is, we look at its origins with Alfred Binet creates the first test for schools. Alfred Binet created the first intelligence test as a result of a request from the French government in order to create a test that would determine which of these school children entering into the school system in France would benefit from special education versus those who can just go on to regular education. From that point on, IQ has always been about school. It is not, and it has never been, nor is it never intended to be, a universal statement about how smart somebody is. Intelligence has always been seen as more complex than that. That doesn't mean that there aren't researchers that went down that line looking for that, one factor. But the truth is People are skilled in different scenarios, they're skilled in different environments, people have different skills and whatnot, and really the modern theories of intelligence describe intelligence better. That doesn't mean IQ isn't important, because IQ does give us the information that we need to determine what kind of help somebody needs in school. Now, Lewis Terman brings Alfred Binet's test to the U.S. and creates the Stanford-Binet test, which is still with us today. By the way, I skipped a little piece, a little factoid. We just talked about Piaget a second ago, and we have been all semester. An interesting piece of history is that Piaget was not originally a psychologist. He was a brilliant person in many ways, and he was hired by Binet to crunch some of the numbers, to do the statistics for standardizing his test. While he was doing that, he, with his keen observation skills, noticed that when children of a certain age made a mistake, let's say it was a multiple choice and A, B, C, and D, and the correct answer was A, they chose B. What he was curious about was, which shows how good of a scientist he was, why did they always pick B instead of one of the other wrong answers? We know they didn't know the right answer, which was A, let's say. But how come so many of them picked B? Is there something going on that led them to conclude that B was the answer, and that led him down the road to develop this rich qualitative cognitive theory that we've been talking about? So this little connection between this first intelligence test and Piaget's work that we are still working on today. Now, the Terman refined the IQ to what we know today. We have a test that determines the mental age. This is if you take the test and you score, your score, which age does it line up with, in terms of the average score? If I'm 5 years old, but I score like the average 7-year-old, then my mental age is 7. Chronological age, 5, and we get this quotient, mental age over chronological age, multiplied by 100 to remove the decimal point, and that gives us that IQ. Now, because it's a formula, it's a ratio, we automatically set the mean to be 100 and the standard deviation to be 10 points on either side of that. So there's some statistical quackery here. Sorry, it's not even, where'd that come? Some statistical manipulation to make these numbers easy to understand. It's not quackery at all. The average of anybody taking an IQ test is 100. And about 2.5 standard deviations above that is the world of geniuses. 2+ standard deviations below that is the world of individuals who need to get into special education. And that continues to this day. And so some cool history that's still with us. Today we have the SAT. Some of you might be familiar with the graduate record exam, which is a version of the SAT for graduate school, the continued Stanford-Binet, and the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, revised, that they call Whisker, which I think is cute. So that brings us to the fact that IQ doesn't really cover it all, although it's important in school. Let's move on to our first theorist here, Robert Sternberg, and his triarchic theory of intelligence. Personally, my favorite of the three. Now, Sternberg recognizes that analytical, or what he called analytical or componential intelligence, does exist. This is what you would get out of a traditional IQ test, but that doesn't cover it all. He also felt that creative and experiential intelligence, these are individuals who have lots of experience or are naturally creative. This is another aspect of intelligence aside just from the raw sort of cognitive power measured by the IQ. And finally, practical or contextual intelligence. No matter how smart you are, if you don't know how to survive in the woods, you will die, most likely. okay, or you go to a foreign country, contextually you're not very smart. You may be smart in every other way, and those other ways would certainly help you to navigate in a place where you're contextually behind. But nonetheless, that's a separate story. So this really gives a lot of credit, gives a academic nod to the types of intelligence that develop because individuals grew up having a certain kind of lifestyle. And so, very cool. Now that brings us to our final modern theory of multiple intelligence, and that is Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. And we have a nice little graphic here, and we'll take a really close look at that. And his, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 intelligences. We start off here with the most recent one, which is the naturist. This is an individual who has a propensity to understand living things and the grand interconnectedness, sort of ecological thinking. Musical intelligence, discerning sounds, pitch, tone, playing musical instruments. Logical and mathematical, this comes right from the IQ test. This is an individual who is able to manipulate numbers well. Existential, look at this one. Tackling the questions, the big questions, why we live and why we die. Interpersonal, understanding the emotions of others. This is very close to emotional intelligence, or one half of emotional intelligence. Body kinesthetic, the ability to move around. These are dancers and athletes. Linguistic, people are good at languages, speaking, writing. Intrapersonal, now these are individually the other half of emotional intelligence, understanding your own feelings and what those are all about. And then finally, spatial, visualizing the world. These are good photographers and people that don't get lost very often. So some interesting ways in which all of us, you could probably, and I'm going to be asking you to look at each one of those, and I want you to talk about your own experiences, where you are with that, each one, all 9. Some of those you're good at, some of those you're not. And then in the ones where you're not, do you know anybody who is? Like, in terms of spatial intelligence, I can't take a picture and make it look good, but my sister, every time she takes a picture, it could probably go in a museum. It's like perfectly composed, the sun's coming through. It's just has that kind of skill. Now we transition here to talk about probably the largest transition going on through this stage, and that is the movement into the school environment. And I want to talk about this in the context of another theory, and that is Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory, where we have a model here of the concentric mechanisms of our society and how they interact with one another that have an influence on child development. So let's take a closer look here at this one. This is not, we talk about Bronfenbrenner's theory usually when we talk about personality, and we look at how people have found their way to fit into the larger social structure. Talk about it in sociology as well. It is a developmental theory in that we become over time, we become increasingly aware of the concentric circles of influence in terms of how our human ecology interacts with us. So here we are, and at this age, we're an individual, and that individual interacts in the first of these microsystems, the family. Now we're entering school, and we have a number of peers. And we can see this individual is nested in like 3 areas, particularly at this age. They've just gone to school, they have new peers, they've had their family for a while, and this is helping that individual identify who they are. Now, because the school interacts with outside services, not just social services, but government and regulations and school boards and whatnot, we experience that relationship. How do I manage as an individual and as a family of the expectations of society, which are in the exosystem, the expectations of family, school, and peers, which are in the microsystem, and that exists in the mesosystem, which is this is the communication process between larger exosystems and microsystems. You could probably, and sometimes when I've talked about this, I've placed the school in the exosystem. And then there's another system beyond that that regulates the school. But sometimes the family and the individual sort of negotiating with the expectations of the school. That kind of process. Nonetheless, the child enters the school system and they're exposed to a whole new set of interesting factors that influence their life. And as we've been saying, they start to be evaluated based on standards. You're smart, but how smart are you compared to your peers? You're this old, are you at the same developmental place as other people who are also that old? And you see the structure of IQ, preparedness for school, the basic building blocks for school success, and the grade system. Now we know that not all 5-year-olds are at the same stage. In fact, at this early stage, they're kind of all over the place sometimes. Yet we still have grades. All the 5-year-olds are in kindergarten, all the 6-year-olds are in first grade, second, on, and those are age norms. So here's this introduction to a child who's developing in their own timeline, but society is now imposing upon them a timeline, an artificial, well thought out, well experienced, works for most people, but nonetheless artificial system of expectations and development. So you see those expectations there, comparison to your peers, grades like individual grades, like whether you got an A or a B. This is all introduced during this time. We have the notion of competition. I mean, there's only one person who's going to get that plastic spider, and if that's the reward, those kinds of things, this winning sort of idea and its complexities, and then new social norms associated with not only the school's expectations, but the new people that you're meeting, the diverse cultures, even, and I mean that in a very generic way, not just greatly diverse cultures, people from other nations and other ethnic backgrounds, but simply, what happens at Billy's house versus Sammy's house, two different cultures, and, Billy comes home, speaking some of the language that's okay at Sammy's house, and we're like, okay, maybe that's not right. Those kinds of experiences as well. Now, while this is happening, other development is also happening, and that's mainly our psychosocial model here from Erickson. So look right here. Here we have school age, and Erickson identifies that the quandary here is industry, learning what I'm good at, versus inferiority. You can't be inferior unless you're comparing. Inferior is a word that describes your relative place. Am I superior or inferior? So we see the school system embedding this first thought process of being superior and inferior. Not that that couldn't have been embedded before, but now it's formalized in the school system. Some people resist this. Some people think that this is not a good thing. However, it is really, now that the individual has the cognitive skills to understand themselves in a multiple ways, and we have to think of all this. We have to get away from IQ, think about multiple intelligence, so that we can allow children to go in, discover what they're good at, also discover what they can improve at, also discover what they're not going to be good at. We all have those things, and we do that over a great amount of time. We don't do that structurally. Children discover that for themselves. And those individuals learn to accept those things and focus their strengths on the things that they're good at. What's wrong with that? If we make everybody good at everything, then it's mayonnaise, right? We don't really have the diversity of complex. In fact, the term diversity really does imply that some people are going to be good at things and some people are going to be not as good at those things. And those individuals will have to go and find the things they're good at, and they'll be good at that while the others are not good at. And there will always be people that seem to be good at everything, and there will always be people that struggle to find the thing that they're good at. And that's where the school system can really, really kick in, using models like Gardner's theory to say, let's find out what you're good at. There's all these different things, and I would almost guarantee something's going to be in there. Now, this also leads, this idea of what I'm good at, comparison, leads to the kind of development that brings us in contact with select peers and select self-concept that formulate our first sense of identity when we go into adolescence. So we're going to cover adolescence. We're going to look at those first 4 stages and really concentrate on this idea of what I'm good at and what I'm not good at compared to my peers as a way of exploring the first formulations of identity development. Now, quite quickly here, we're going to take a little journey back to Piaget. This time, however, we're going to be talking about moral development. I told you I was going to talk about this, how cognitive development now allows children to be able to figure out ahead of time how they're going to deal with the particular situations, or maybe after the situation think about and put themselves in other people's shoes so they can make, quote unquote, the right decisions. Now, what we get is a model that was based on Piaget and is very closely linked to Piaget's stages, but it was developed actually by Lawrence Kohlberg, a researcher who was working in the juvenile system, trying to figure out why these kids are making such bad decisions. Now, there's some history with Kohlberg about working just with boys because he was working in the juvenile delinquency area, primarily populated by boys, and he worked at all boys facilities. And he came up with a theory that was largely sexist in a way because it did not include the moral development and the kind of different societal expectations that we see when young girls are being raised. So we have 2 general models of moral development: the justice perspective that we see from Kohlberg, and you can see where that word came from, and the cares perspective, which came from a researcher by the name of Carol Gilligan. And I didn't include her work in here in terms of this lecture, but I really encourage you to look at her work too, who recognized that young girls and young boys are socialized differently. So as they progress themselves through the stages, they might end up in different places, but those don't necessarily mean that girls are inferior in terms of moral development to boys, which in fact Kohlberg stated, and that of course caused a lot of problems. And so I'm covering Kohlberg because it's the one that has the richest literature support. However, cognitively we can think about Gilligan's research too, that sometimes this theory misses the mark for young girls. However, that doesn't mean it's not still a valid instrument in terms of understanding moral development, how it corresponds particularly with Piaget's stages. So here we have our theory here, and we have pre-conventional, it aligns very well, pre-operational, and we have 2 sub-stages in there. Now this model answers this question. Given a moral dilemma, a child comes up with an answer as to what they would do. The answer itself is pretty irrelevant. The logic behind it is what we're looking at. What are you thinking? Why are you making that decision? This is what you decide to do can go either way and can have a multiplicity of reasons. What we see are categories of the reasons why an individual would choose the way they did. We analyze this very anecdotally. This is not a test per se. We would look at the way somebody responds to a particular dilemma and we would say, why did you choose that way? And based on what they tell us, categorize what level of thinking they. And as adults, we have access to all of them because sometimes we use quote unquote lower levels of reasoning to make decisions in what we're going to do. Maybe I'm going to do something just because it feels good. That's it. In another instance, I'm going to do something not because it feels good. In fact, it might cause me pain, but because it's a very, very high ethical value of mine, and that's how I will react to those situations. And you'll see the same individual responding at all different levels of moral development. So let's go through them. Remember, these are not so concrete measurable stages per se, as much as they are categories for understanding the reasons why someone would make a particular decision. So here we are in our pre-conventional, and within pre-conventional, we see decisions that are made on punishment and obedience. Right and wrong are defined by what you get punished for, and powerful characters within your world, like parents, they're always right. The next level, still within pre-operational, is the instrumental. Right and wrong is now determined by what we are rewarded for and by doing what others want. Any concern for others is motivated by selfishness. Now we can be doing things for others, but it is primarily for our own gain. It's similar, but we're doing for others for our own gain. Now that gets really close here to conventional, where we see concrete operational thinking. The instrumental one is sort of the I scratch your back, you scratch mine. The interpersonal one, this is I want to be part of the group. Interpersonal concordance means being good is whatever pleases others, the group. The child adopts conformist attitude to morality. Right and wrong are determined by the majority. And then we get into law and order. Now that there's society has developed a social, what we call the social contract, which is a set of moral conditions that we call the law and law and order, and that is how I will make my decisions. Now this conventional way of thinking and concrete operational thinking is where we spend most of our lives, and in fact Piaget felt that the vast majority of people do not move on to formal operational thinking and in this case the other stages of moral development because there's no need to. However, higher education, more complex jobs, more tricky dilemmas require the kind of development that we're going to see when we talk about adolescence and adulthood when we look at formal operational thinking. So we still need to have an understanding of those. But you could probably imagine most of the people that you know probably operate on a what's good for the group, good for me, what's law and order, that's the way things should be, that's how people should react. Now, I did mention the social contract, and that was, I did that in terms of law and order. However, in post-conventional, more like formal operational thinking, the social contract is an agreed upon document and therefore a product of human beings, and therefore I can interpret it differently. I can say, okay, this is where the Patriots, not the football team, the Patriots that started America, when they said, okay, we understand that there's a set of laws here, but people got together and they agreed about that, so I can disagree and try to change that law and make it more in line. This is that next level. I mean, I'm not just going to say that's what everybody went with, that's the law of the land. I can actually disagree and be an objector of that particular law and break the law in the name of I don't agree with the law. And the law is not sacred because the law is a social contract, something we all agreed on, and I'm currently not agreeing, and therefore I don't have to follow it. And then we get into the last one, universal ethical principles that transcend all of these. And in terms of I do things because I deeply believe in them. Now, we have to be careful. My experience with having people self-reflect on this is we are way, way overrepresenting how many things we do that represent those universal ethical principles. Most of what we do, me included, is based in law and order. Most is based at sometimes with the social contract. Very rarely are we put in circumstances where we have to take that higher order ethical product. Those might still be there, but many of the things that we do is back and forth. When we say things like thank you, that for someone doing something, maybe it's a social convention for us and we think that's the right thing to do, but it's also polite and it may increase better service next time. Or if let's say I'm interacting with the table server and I say to that person something nice, like thank you, that's a really good job, and I actually have a tendency to do that. I tend to point out really good service interpersonally. I say, I want to thank you for what you just did. You did all this. And part of that is an ethical principle of rewarding people when I see the opportunity, but it also increases the likelihood that I'm going to get great service. So there's almost like a scratch your back, scratch my back sort of quality to that. Now, here's the point. We bring this up right now because we're in that concrete operational thinking, and we can now move beyond the selfishness of early egocentric thinking when we're talking to kids about moral decisions. We can talk about rules in games. Remember, we talked about that? And we can talk about that the games have rules, and we agree upon those rules, and we act in those. The household has rules. Kindergarten classrooms have rules. Sports have rules. All of these things. This is the rule-making age, and it has to do with interpersonal concordance. These are the rules we're going to agree on, and law and order. This is the rule book. And we can shift back. Let's say we're playing a game, and we can change the rules in order to accommodate for the different people that are around. Let's say when the kids below, let's say you're playing soccer, you can have slightly different rules for the really little kids than the older kids in terms of how you get the ball away from them. You can modify the rules, and that helps us with that interpersonal concordance. We can kind of have that agreement right on the fly. But then we have a rule book about how the game is played. You don't pick up the ball with your hands when you're playing soccer. Those kinds of things. Rules, rule making, and rule negotiating is a huge, huge part of this stage of development. So there we go. We're at the end of our chapter, and the assessments for this particular week include two discussions. One is to look at schools and industry, and I'm going to change this expectations of this particular discussion based on what I just talked about. I wouldn't mind if you talked about rules and how that impacts a person's industry too. But schools come in, they start doing this comparison thing, and maybe you thought you were good at something and you find out that when you go to the school you're not as good at it, or maybe you have a latent trait, you go to school, you find out you're really great at it. What were your experiences of that? And then bringing this into the context, that same sort of a second discussion here, looking at industry again and what happened with COVID. Now, one of the challenges of COVID and the isolation was a reduced opportunity for the kinds of lesson making that happens when you interact with peers, that make this determination, make this pecking order, who's good at something and who's not so good, and those kinds of things. The positive elements of those went away along with the negative elements of those. And so always we want to consider that even though, yeah, quite likely some bullying didn't happen, you know, some of that pecking order stuff that can happen on the playground didn't happen, but some of those natural ways in which we become, you know, more attuned to what we're good at and not good at didn't happen either. So how might that have impacted people's industry? And finally, back on my slideshow here. I messed up. There. COVID in industry, and then finally a quiz. Your personal experiences with concrete operational thinking, and as I said before, a personal example of each one of Gardner's 9 intelligences. Your current perspective of how you are on each one of those, and examples of others, of course welcomed as well. And that is it for today. Whew. Interesting stage of development. So I look forward to reading all of these answers and seeing you in the discussion boards, and have a great, very hot, sunny week.